here with one of the most exciting acquisitions ever for the UFC. Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar.
Yeah.
Not Larson. There's another Brock that fights in WEC. It's a very talented gentleman. But we're talking about Brock Lesnar.
In the late 2000s, the Ultimate Fighting Championship was in its teenage years, like literally. In 2007, the company was just 15 years old. The UFC and sport as a whole was just reaching new heights in terms of recognition and popularity. And with that growth, superstars within the realm of MMA were being molded. 2007 saw the likes of Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, Rampage Jackson, GSP, and Anderson Silva, to name a few. These guys were all big names in their own right, but nowhere near the levels that Brock was at the time. Lesnar was a household name and making millions with the WWE. He had one MMA fight at that point, was an NCAA heavyweight wrestling champ, a football player, pro wrestler, professor, and a security guard. With such a diverse array of careers, Lesnar decided to venture into the wild world of the UFC. The date was set. Brock's debut would be at UFC 81 in February of 2008, and his opponent was no warm-up or easy test. For the guy's first fight in the UFC, he was going up against Frank fucking Mir, a well-established MMA fighter, and former UFC heavyweight champ. Dana most likely saw this as like a one-time thing where Lesnar would come in, bring a bunch of eyes, lose, and then bounce. And although Brock did ultimately end up losing the fight by submission after a questionable point deduction and position change by the referee, he did have his moments and controlled Mir via wrestling and some ground and pound. Still, with the fight only lasting 90 seconds, like when Brock said he'll
Get on top of my wife tonight.
You couldn't really argue that Brock was out of his realm going into MMA. Brock would return just 6 months later and take on Heath Herring. Here is where Brock truly shined. He dominated Herring all 3 rounds with good stand-up, takedowns, and ground control. Now I get it, Herring isn't the biggest name in the sport, but this fight really showed everyone that Brock was the real deal. Not polished, but a genetic monster that learned quick. Next up, Lesnar was once again rushed to the top, but this time with the belt on the line, going up against the champ, Randy Couture. Brock basically ragdolled the old man, and after some of the nastiest and sharpest elbows in the history of the UFC,
Survive! He's a short little shot!
Brock Lesnar became the UFC heavyweight champion. Although he was the champ, Lesnar was still criticized by many of the MMA diehards. Lesnar's run was rushed, or he was fighting old guys past their prime, and Lesnar did have a big mouth. But at the end of the day, the man was the face of the UFC and generated millions of pay-per-view and was more popular than anyone the company had ever seen before. For Lesnar's first title defense, he'd get some sweet payback at UFC 100 on Frank Mir, who had something stuck up his ass.
Frank Mir had a horseshoe up his ass.
Brock would beat Mir's face in and defend his title once more at UFC 116 against Shane Carwin. Carwin would come out guns a-blazing and unloaded on Brock the first round, but the fight was somehow not stopped. With the WWE roster in attendance and coming out in full force to support Brock, there was no way he was letting them down. I mean, come on, you had Stone Cold, Goldberg, and The Undertaker. Brock would come back and go on to choke Carwin in the second round, who was clearly exhausted from putting in an ass whooping on Lesnar a minute earlier. From here begins the downfall of Brock's UFC career. His next opponent would be Cain Velasquez, who would go on to become one of the greatest, if not the greatest, heavyweight champion of all time. At UFC 121 in October of 2010, Cain would show that his technique and ability was levels ahead of Lesnar. Cain would get back up, stuff takedowns, and outland Brock until he finished him with 1 minute to go in the first round. Lesnar would have surgery to treat his diverticulitis and return over a year later to face another mutant in the form of Alistair Overeem. However, the Reem would quickly end the dream as he would kick Lesnar right where he had surgery and end the fight. Brock would return to the WWE and after 5 years make a surprise comeback to the UFC and defeat Mark Hunt by decision. Unbelievably, the fight was made a no contest as somehow Lesnar tested positive. Overall, Lesnar certified that he's a badass and helped propel the UFC to where it is today. The man transitioned worlds jumping into the UFC and became the face of the company. He brought over new fans and made Uncle Dana money.
No, I like money.
It's crazy to think, what if Lesnar trained MMA way earlier and if he remained healthy throughout his career?
Brock Lesnar, some weird instance, where, you know, Vikings fucked Vikings for generation after generation, and their warrior bloodlines were passed on, and this motherfucker living in the woods in Minnesota, you know, he got the best of the best. His fucking head is that big.
1,000 years ago, the only way you saw a guy like this is if they came up on your shore in a boat, and then you ran.
He was a Viking.
Yeah.
Fuck Nazis, dude. He would have been on one of them boats with a dragon on the front of it.
Get that guy the size of Brock Lesnar, he might be able to fuck you on this stage. He might just drag you up here. Pants doing Brock smash!